Hello there. So it's Saturday, the 24th of August. I am in the office while Gordon takes a couple of parties around the grounds. And I thought I would talk about one of the elements of running a restoration project which we've struggled with. See, one of the odd things about listed buildings is the planning environment around them, the bureaucracy. For a start, listed buildings are protected by law, and it's not just civil law, it's criminal law too, which means as an owner, or anyone really, who by commission of action or omission damages a listed building or structure can be prosecuted under criminal law. Well, that is if Historic Environment Scotland deems it necessary to take forward a prosecution. Another element of listing is that there is a buildings at risk register in the UK. All listed buildings which are not in good repair are listed in this database, and a summary of the issues is attached to each structure. Both Dunans Castle and Bridge are on the register, with the castle being at most risk, obviously, given that it doesn't have a roof. Oftentimes, this listing and the classification of the buildings as being at risk has been used to impute bad faith on the part of Sadie and myself to officials working for organisations concerned with the protection of historic buildings, by usually folks who really don't understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the context of the costs around historic buildings and their restoration, of which I'll get into a bit more in a bit. And you might ask, who would do such a thing? And we've had several experiences, but I'm not going to rehearse that. And I'm just going to point you at my YouTube channel, look for Charles Dixon-Spain, where you'll find a really good example recently of this kind of thing. So, Dunans Castle is B-listed, and Dunans Bridge is A-listed. There is also the Fletcher Mausoleum, which is C-listed. A rule of thumb to distinguish these classifications is that C is locally important, B regionally important, and A nationally important. And now you're asking why the bridge gets top listing, rather than the vision of loveliness that is the castle. Well, I suppose it comes down to the fact that the bridge was designed by the eminent Victorian engineer Thomas Telford. And because it's a Thomas Telford, it already steps above the castle, which was designed by the not so eminent Andrew Kerr, who is an Edinburgh architect. The bridge is an unusual example of Telford's genius, because it's 3 arches, and he usually only built single arch rubble built bridges. It uses Gothic arches when usually he used curved arches. It has 8 octagonal stanchions, which are very unusual. And to top it all off, the bridge is decorated by 3 gargoyles. And if you know anything about Thomas Telford, you know that he was really about the function over form. He didn't like fripperies, he didn't go for them. It was really about creating elegant structures that would be commensurate with the need they fulfilled. Now, with the castle, it is a fairly good example of the popular Franco-baronial style of the mid-Victorian era, which is often found in the mountains and glens on the eastern side of Scotland. It is uncommon on the west coast, and that's why it is regionally important. And its listing also benefits from its association and pairing with the bridge. I do sometimes wonder whether it would be listed without the bridge. The mausoleum, in contrast, is a very conventional Victorian building. It's at the moment entirely inaccessible, standing as it does in a woodland dell owned by the Fletchers, but surrounded on all sides by the garden of someone inimical to the public access of built heritage in general, and that of the Fletchers in particular. So these three listed buildings, all built by the Fletchers in the 18th century, create an interesting collection which is distinguished by the bridge. This means, of course, that any development within the curtilage of the bridge, castle or mausoleum should also be subject to listed building consent. This was the case for the Red Shed, the chalet that Sadie and I built in 2003 when we arrived at Dunans. The structure was intended to be temporary, to last for maybe 18 months while we restored the house. Well, 18 months turned into 4.5 years, and our temporary accommodation became somewhat more permanent until in the last month, I mean literally this last month, some 20 years since we first built it, we obtained permission to retain the building as a residential facility annexed to the house. In other words, the Red Shed became essential to the ongoing restoration project, providing accommodation to folks, helping us with the repair, maintenance and restoration of the buildings and landscape at Dunans. The listing also means that whenever we consider development, we must ensure that the plans are in keeping with the surrounding buildings, or at least do not impact on the setting of the same. For example, the Scottish Laird office is masked by vegetation and trees. The conservatory is a mirror of the original Fletcher glasshouse. The former is used as part of the accommodation for the family, and the latter provided salad and fruit for the castle kitchen. It's why any threat to any of the structures from external agencies or individuals must be dealt with adroitly. Obviously, we insist all deliveries abide by the weight limit on the bridge. No structures are placed on or around the bridge, and when anyone does anything classified as development, a listed building consent is applied for. It is the case that we have not always been on top of the planning process, unfortunately. And so latterly, given our experience, we have employed planning specialists to guide us through the labyrinthine swathe of regulations. But even then, it gets pretty esoteric. In 2021, for example, we decided to build the oft-postponed conservatory, which I mentioned earlier. We'd received all the necessary consents in 2005, but importantly, a building warrant and completion certificate in the early 2010s was issued for the works on the house, which were part of that particular consent. Now, unbeknownst to me, that certificate of completion somehow rendered the planning consent for the conservatory obsolete. And forgive me if my phraseology and process isn't quite right, because, as I say, it's quite esoteric. But it meant that even though we had a design which was exactly as previously specified, and even though we had listed building consent, which was effectively still pertinent, and even though our building warrant was approved, etc., we were still required to apply for retrospective planning consent. As you can imagine, the fact that the paperwork was out of date and we had to reapply was a major headache. Hence the planning consultants. By using the services of someone like this, we were able to gain some level of objectivity as well as a grip on the process and create a timetable for the paperwork which suited everyone. So we received the consent in late July 24, which was, I must say, a relief. Now, all this stands as preamble to the greatest bureaucratic process we will have to engage with over the next couple of years, namely interacting with Historic Environment Scotland and Argyll and Bute Council Planning Department. Neither organisation has been difficult, and I have to emphasise that. They've been very helpful. Rather, we have presented and will present some unusual problems or tasks to those august organisations. As I've mentioned elsewhere in different places at different times, we would like to take a staged approach to the restoration of the castle. Not, I hasten to add, on the basis of moving to a single point in time when the whole building is commissioned. No, we'd like to renovate the castle compartment by compartment, opening each compartment to lairds and ladies for rental to stay in as they are renovated and become accessible. We think this will create some very unusual and potentially challenging hurdles for both planners and our health and safety people. And the reason this is necessary is because the full restoration cost is likely to be in excess of 10 million. And the eventual value of the whole property is likely to be no more than 2 million. I mean, it might be a bit more if we do a spectacular job or if it becomes a highly desirable building, but it's never going to cover the 10 million pounds of the costs. And that, of course, means that we can't borrow the restoration cost against the eventual value of the asset. And that then leads us to taking the incremental approach, spending money as we earn it, as we raise it, and therefore not exposing ourselves to risk. We have a much more manageable level of debt, and therefore that makes finishing this project more likely, if a little more temporarily distant. So when I'm asked at the end of a tour, when can people stay in the castle, I'm now able to say, well, there will be potentially a couple of apartments in 2026. So all of that, there are two things that I should also say. First, we're sure that the planners would prefer one planning application which will cover the whole project. And if indeed we require that consent, which I suspect we will, at least for the works in the castle itself, a single application is therefore a major expense, given that we will really only be able to form that paperwork with the help of an architect. And then second, famously, architects charge a proportion of the cost of the development, in this case probably calculated at a significant percentage of the cost per square foot, estimated square foot, that is. Because, of course, this is not an off-the-shelf application. And we also require drawings from someone with experience of historic buildings in Scotland. How do we work around this or through this? I find it really difficult to conceive of a way of moving forward, combining all of these various assets. But move forward we must. So with the carbon offset project generating a budget, and that budget being available to us next year at some point, we anticipate that we're going to restore the interstitial area, which is the bit between the already restored house and the castle, and then also the tower. Now, the interstitial was part of the original plans, and therefore is a restoration of what was in place before. The second part, the tower that we are considering, will again be a discrete element of the final structure that we can work on, and provides us with a proof of concept for this incremental, step-by-step movement towards restoration. What the answer is, or rather, we're taking the next logical step to cross the metaphorical river I talk in the admonitions, will lead us, I'm unclear. Suffice to say, and here's the bit that might be interactive, if you have suggestions on process, cost or bureaucracy, let me know. I'm not sure I have completely outlined all of the ramifications of listing there, but you can see how it ties in with the project as it stands, what we have to achieve, and what our intention must be to bring all of the bureaucracies, all of the organisations we need to interact with on board. We've done quite a few things which should enable that, not least the works we've done with Eland and our AIP volunteers on the bridge and the curtain wall and the steps out front of the castle. But given the type of costs that we are talking about, I am becoming increasingly concerned, worried, anxious perhaps, stressed, all of those negative things. But it's not negative, it's anticipation, and it's potential for really enjoying getting to grips with the process. I'm kind of, at the moment, I'm almost feeling as though I'm sort of poking these things and not really getting into the guts of it until I find a template which I will then be able to move forward. Sadie keeps saying, right, we've got to get an architect, we've got to, and she's right, but who that is, how that works, why I'm being so tentative, I can't imagine. Anyway, so that's my discourse for this time. I hope you've enjoyed getting an insight into listing and what it means for Dunans. I'm not sure what the next discursive episode will be. I hope I'm going to get Sadie. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the further admonitions I'll be publishing over the next couple of days.